guys, and welcome back to Reading Club. So today I'm going to read you My Weird School, Mrs. Cooney is Loony, Chapter 3, and Chapter 4. Chapter 3, My Big Decision. She made you balance a yardstick on your nose, Ryan asked. He couldn't believe it. I had to cluck like a chicken too, he said. Mrs. Cooney is loony, said Michael. We were sitting around the vomitorium, eating lunch. I gave Ryan my disgusting applesauce, and he gave me his cupcake. Ryan will eat anything. Ryan and Michael told me that after math was over, Miss Daisy taught the class about vowels. Vowels are the letters A, E, I, O, and U, Michael told me. I thought vowels were E-I-E-I-O, I said, like an old MacDonald had a farm. Sometimes Y is a vowel, asked Ryan. Sometimes, I asked. Well, is Y a vowel or isn't it? Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, Michael said. I think Y should make up its mind, I said. It was time to clean off our table. It was also time for me to tell the guys about my big decision. I had been thinking about it all during lunch. I was thinking about it so much I could barely enjoy Ryan's cupcake. Guys, I said, you're my best friends. So I have to let you in on a secret. Promise not to tell anyone. Promise, promised Ryan and Michael. When I grow up, I said, I'm gonna marry Mrs. Cooney. Ooh, Ryan shouted. AJ and Mrs. Cooney are in love. Shut up, I lied. You promised. AJ, girls have cooties, Michael said. Everybody knows that. Only little girls have cooties, I told him. Grown-up girls don't have cooties, and even if they did, I'm sure Mrs. Cooney has a cootie cure. She is a trained nurse, you know. I never should have told Ryan and Michael my big news. Maybe Mrs. Cooney will want to marry me, Ryan said. Hey, I thought of marrying her first, I said. Maybe she'll marry all of us, said Michael. Suddenly, at the next table, Miss Smarty Pants Know-It-All, who should have an elevator fall on her head, turned around. You silly dumbheads, Andrea said. Mrs. Cooney is already married. What? We all said. How do you know? That's why she's called Mrs. Cooney, Andrea said. If she wasn't married, she'd be called Miss Cooney. Andrea thinks she knows so much. And now she knows I'm in love with Mrs. Cooney. I wish I could punch her. As we scraped our trays into the garbage can, Ryan and Michael decided that they would marry Mrs. Cooney even if she was already married. They said that they were going to pretend to be sick so they could go see Mrs. Cooney too. Hey, that was my idea, I complained. That was a good idea, said Michael. That's not fair, I said. It is too, said Ryan. As it turned out, none of us had to pretend to be sick and go see Mrs. Cooney. Clear off your desks, said Miss Daisy when we got back to class. Mrs. Cooney is coming to talk to us. All right. Chapter 4, The Last Straw. Miss Daisy told us to be on our best behavior while she called Mrs. Cooney on the intercom. So as soon as she turned her back on the class, me and Michael got up and shook our butts. Finally, after about 1,100,000 minutes of waiting, Mrs. Cooney walked in the door. Va-va-va-voom, I whispered to Michael, who sits next to me. I really don't know what va-va-va-voom means, but that's what my dad always says when he sees a picture of that movie star who looks like Mrs. Cooney. I'm in love, Michael said. Me too, said Ryan, who was sitting behind me. Me three, I said. It was bad enough that Mrs. Cooney had a husband. Now Michael and Ryan were in love with her too. How would I ever get Mrs. Cooney to marry me instead of all those other guys? My friend Billy around the corner knows a lot about girls. He says, the way to get a girl to like you is to make her laugh. So I decided that I would try that. What are you going to teach us today, Mrs. Cooney, asked Miss Daisy. Today we're going to learn about nutrition, said Mrs. Cooney. Does anybody know what a food pyramid is? Sure, I said. That's what they eat in Egypt. Some of the kids laughed, but Mrs. Cooney didn't. I would have to try harder. Please raise your hand instead of shouting out, said Mrs. Cooney. Andrea? The food pyramid shows the groups of food that make up a good diet, Andrea said. Good, Andrea, said Mrs. Cooney as she held up a big poster of a pyramid with food all over it. She gave Andrea a smiley face sticker for her notebook. Andrea has so many smiley face stickers on her notebook that you can hardly see the notebook anymore. Can anyone name all the food groups? Asked Mrs. Cooney. This time I raised my hand, and Mrs. Cooney called on me. The refrigerator, the freezer, the pantry, and the kitchen cabinets, I said. That's where we group the food in my house. A few kids laughed. Mrs. Cooney crossed her arms in front of her and tapped her foot until the laughing died down. She had on a serious face. She's cute when she's serious. Not exactly, she said. Andrea had her hand in the air as usual, and she got called on. Andrea named all the dumb food groups and got another smiley face sticker. Why doesn't a food pyramid fall on Andrea's head? I wish I could punch her. Good, said Mrs. Cooney. Kids, where you eat may be as important as what you eat. Tell me, where do you usually eat your meals? In my mouth, I said. Where else would I eat my meals? No, I mean, do you eat in your kitchen? Mrs. Cooney asked. Do you eat in the car? Do you usually eat in front of the TV? We eat all our meals in front of the TV, I said. Why, AJ? Asked Mrs. Cooney. Because there's no room behind the TV, I said. We'd be squished. All the kids laughed. Mrs. Cooney put her hands on her hips and wrinkled up her forehead at me. But she still wasn't laughing. Maybe she was in a bad mood. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day, Mrs. Cooney said. You can't do good work at school if you haven't eaten a good breakfast. That goes for grown-ups too. For example, it's hard for me to work on an empty stomach. You shouldn't work on an empty stomach, Mrs. Cooney, I said. You should work on your desk. Everybody laughed at that one. Mrs. Cooney slapped her own forehead like there was a bug in it. AJ, said Mrs. Cooney, can you please try not to shout things out? Now, how many of you eat breakfast in your pajamas? That's disgusting, I said. My mom puts my breakfast on a plate. AJ, go sit in the hall, Mrs. Cooney said. That's the last straw. What does straws have to do with anything? She wasn't even talking about straws. Why are grown-ups constantly running out of straws? I offered to bring some more straws from home, but Mrs. Cooney said she didn't want them. Na-na-na-boo-boo, Michael whispered when I went to sit in the hall. I was in love with Mrs. Cooney, but she sure wasn't in love with me. So that's the end of this channel. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please click many likes and subscribe to Reading Club. So I'll come back later with a new and improved channel. Bye everybody, see you later.